Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the first talk in the Why Arts Matter speaker series. This is the beginning of an ongoing conversation, a call to recognize the arts as a critical voice in shaping how we understand ourselves, our societies, and our world. At the heart of this series is the belief that the arts, whether history, philosophy, languages, literature, fine arts, theatre, or music, offer critical perspectives, creativity, and diverse ways of knowing that enrich how we understand ourselves, society, and the world. They're not separate from the sciences or other disciplines, but deeply interconnected, contributing to the ways we navigate global challenges, and Lord knows there's enough of those these days, social life and individual experience. It's especially fitting that we're launching this series in the Improv Lab, this beautiful space here, a space dedicated to creative exploration, collaboration, and boundary-pushing artistic practices. Designed for research, performance, and community engagement, the Improv Lab allows us to bring these discussions to life in an interactive and dynamic environment. It's a place where ideas take shape, where innovation thrives, and where the impact of the arts can be explored in real time. And that's what we're going to do this afternoon. So first of all, before we go any further, I would like to recognize that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Atawandron and Haudenosaunee people, and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbors have with this land. We recognize that today this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our relationships to this land where we learn and work. We commit to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We must do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. With the intent to extend this series to bring together researchers, artists, and thinkers from various fields in the community, Why Arts Matter invites us to explore the intersections of disciplines and challenge the boundaries of knowledge. This series will not only celebrate artistic and scholarly excellence, but also make these discussions accessible to a broad audience, ensuring that the impact of the arts reaches beyond academia. So, without any further ado, I am very, very pleased to introduce our panelists, moving from my left across to the other side of the room, Troy Hourie. Troy is a performance designer and inter-arts installation artist. He was a New York City-based performance designer for almost 15 years, during which he designed over 350 productions of plays, musicals, and operas. He's moved back to Canada now and is based in Toronto. He's a dual Canadian-American citizen and works in both countries, and Troy is a Métis artist. His opera and theatre credits include the Glimmerglass Festival, the New Victory, New York Theatre Workshop, Cherry Lane Theatre, Brooklyn Academy of Music, Classical Theatre of Harlem, the Guthrie, Bay Street Theatre, Williamstown, Huntington Theatre, Jupiter Maltz Theatre, Sarasota Opera, Nashville Opera, Austin Lyric Opera, and Virginia Opera.
More.
His visual art practice revolves around the themes of wonder, spectatorship, immersion, and intermediality. He's interested in exploring the relationship of an audience to performance work and the creation of visceral experiences through performance-based art and installation work in theatre, architecture, and the visual arts. Thank you, Troy. Thanks for being here. Dylan Roberts. Dylan is proud, it says here, proud to be a member of the vibrant Canadian acting community.
I am.
Over the past 30 years, Dylan has had the privilege of contributing to many iconic Canadian productions, from the various works of Michael Hollingsworth and the video cabaret, to the Canadian premieres of The Lord of the Rings, brackets Mirvish, Warhorse, Mirvish, The Laramie Project, Studio 180, and Our Class, Studio 180. Dylan has also contributed extensively to the North American and international film and television industry, having worked with such notable directors as Patricia Rozema, Bruce McCullough, Stella Meggy, Thomas Schlamme, Mira Nair, Doug Lyman, and Sir Richard Attenborough. Having earned his MA in Theatre Studies from the University of Guelph, Dylan is currently in his PhD studies here, exploring the use of performance and story as tools of social justice and transformational change. Having immigrated from Wales to Turtle Island, Dylan understands his complicated ancestral history to colonialism/imperialism and struggles to reconcile his people's history as both victim and perpetrator. Thank you, Dylan, and thank you for being here. Catherine Bush. Catherine Bush is an associate professor of creative writing in the School of Theatre, English and Creative Writing at SOTEC. For 14 years, she was the coordinator of the esteemed Guelph Creative Writing MFA program. She's the author of 5 novels, including Blaze Island from 2020 and the forthcoming story collection, Skin. Do you want to just hold it up? It's not out yet, but she has an advanced copy, out in April. Blaze Island, the 2020 novel, was a Globe and Mail Best Book and winner of a Best Book of the Year award from Writers' Trust of Canada and 49th Shelf. That's just the latest in a series of accolades that Catherine's books have earned. She's taught creative writing at Concordia, in the low-res MFA at the University of British Columbia, at the University of Florida, and for the summer literary seminars in Kenya, as well as at Guelph. Her fiction and non-fiction often address ecological and climate concerns. She's written and spoken internationally about addressing the climate crisis in fiction. In 2024, she was the inaugural Writer-in-Residence Landhaus Fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich, Germany. So thank you all so much for being here. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Okay, you will be relieved to learn that that's almost the end of my bit of it. We're going to get to the conversation. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to introduce our topic for this afternoon's conversation, and then I'm going to ask each speaker just to address that topic for a couple of minutes, just to sort of get some position statements, if you like, or some initial thoughts out on the floor, and then we're going to have a conversation. You're going to have a conversation. I've got some prompts, but we're just fascinated to hear what you have to say about this. So, the topic. Storytelling and the production of everyday life. So the aim of this panel, the first in a series, but this panel is going to explore the vital role of different forms of storytelling in shaping our everyday experiences and perceptions. By examining how various art forms and storytelling create immersive narratives, we will uncover the ways in which they influence our understanding of identity and culture. And we hope and anticipate the discussion will also highlight the significance of historical narratives and indigenous storytelling, revealing how these stories reflect and impact contemporary life. We're excited to see you engage with themes of agency, representation, and the connections between art and everyday existence. And just on a side note, it's fitting, incidentally, that today happens to be World Storytelling Day. Which is actually a real thing. Some of these, World Day of X seem a little bit made up, but this one originated in Scandinavia. It's now a globally recognized a day in Latin America, Australia, and Canada. So world storytelling, it's very appropriate that that's the context in which we're having this conversation. Okay, so perhaps, Troy, I'll start with you. I invite you to give us a little rundown of your thoughts on the topic.
So this is the one time that I probably will read. Well, there's 2 things I probably will have to read for in preparation for this, because it's hard to sort of speak about art and its importance. We write about it all the time in the research that we do, and we talk and we're interviewed about it and such, but it's always hard to return to it. So I'm just going to read what I wrote. So art reflects, ponders, expresses the human experience. Artists in all disciplines desire to create shared experiences. Art is an exchange. Artists expose viewers to objects, environments, performances, stories, and ask that they contemplate the meaning of those pieces based on their own personal experiences. That meaning varies greatly by each individual. When a group of people participate in art and reflect with each other, a community is built. And so I'll start with that and just sort of clarify a little bit. With all of the work I've done, I predominantly have been working in theater, so that theater is a storytelling industry, and we're telling the stories of playwrights for the most part, but also devised work does different things. The other clarification also might be that within Indigenous communities, now that I've become much more immersed in that, storytelling is actually the feature of how community is built. And so there's a lot of the sort of tales and legends that inform how people live. And so I think that that's an important thing to just mention at the beginning.
Super. Thanks, Troy. Dylan.
Yes, I come from a small town off on an island off the coast of North Wales, and every interaction, every conversation, every lesson learned, it revolves around story and storytelling, whether it be a recollection or a myth. It is such an innate, ingrained part of who we are as a people. When I arrived in Canada, that storytelling tradition is so apparent here. And for me, it is the basis of my everyday life. It is my profession. It is my area of study. What's become clear to me and what brought me to my PhD was that there is a system at work that, through no labor of my own, wants to center this positionality. And my story is free of obstruction to be told. And it became clear to me during many cross-cultural collaborations that wasn't the case, that I am the culmination of all those stories that I have engaged with in my life, but also that has a deep effect on who I am are the stories untold and the stories silenced through the silencing of marginalized voices throughout the world and throughout my experience. And that brought me to want to understand how I can contribute to a new path forward and how I can engage and take whatever privilege is provided to me and move myself from the center and join the circle and contribute to a new way of seeing the world. And that is a passion that drove me to a project where I met Troy, and Troy said, this project sounds an awful lot like a master's thesis, which led me to my master's here. And then talking about an extension of that project, Troy said, you know what this sounds like? And I said, please don't say it. And he said, that sounds like a PhD. So here I am. Thank you, Troy. That's where I
Awesome.
find
Yes.
myself.
Thank you, Troy. We're delighted that Dylan's here. And the idea that our lives are the culmination of the stories that we're part of, and that if we're not part of certain stories, that is a significant sort of gap. I think that's a very resonant idea. I'd love to hear more about that in a little while in the conversation. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm a professional storyteller. I write novels. Blaze Island focuses on a climate scientist and his daughter, and it tackles imaginatively some of the ethical dilemmas of our climate responses and the perils of geoengineering. And Skin, my new collection of stories, explores how we create intimacy in fraught times and brings human relationships and our relationships with the more than human world to the fore. Every time I've started to gather my thoughts for this panel, they shift as the current moment keeps shifting, given, as Andrew's already referenced, the multiple emergencies, the polycrises upon us. But each time I begin with this thought, which echoes some of the things that we've heard already, we are storytelling creatures. Stories are fundamental to the way we make meaning of ourselves, others, and the world. Rebecca Solnit, the important American essayist and storyteller, has, since the beginning of the Trump presidency, created a new website for a series of essays written pressed up against the present moment, which she's entitled Meditations on an Emergency. And at the bottom of her site runs a banner that reads, "Every emergency is a storytelling emergency." And I would amend that to add, given our particular context north of the US border, every trade war is a storytelling war. The stories that we tell ourselves and others matter. The stories that we listen to matter. The stories that we believe matter. And in my remarks to come, I want to entwine the importance of how we believe and how we listen to stories with the crucial role of telling them. I also want to disambiguate some of the different contexts for storytelling, how creating a fiction that announces itself as fiction is different than stories that want to remake the world by denying its realities. And we need to talk about this too.
Super, thank you. Yeah, and I think, so World Storytelling, that's a bit glib, right? World Storytelling Day, but we're both discussing something very universal, right? The place of storytelling in human experience, in the creation of cultures and so on, but also potentially something very specific, right? How that addresses this particular moment. And I think it's good to do both, right? I think we want to sort of paint the broader picture, but also this is a moment in which we can really exemplify how storytelling can be a response to a particular set of immediate circumstances. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I say I've got some prompts. These are just prompts, and they go sort of from somewhat general to more specific. So here's the first one, and then we'll take it away. So the first sort of prompt is how do different forms of storytelling across various art forms. So I think that's important. So storytelling understood broadly, not necessarily a written narrative, for example, but other kinds of narrative as well. How does that create immersive experiences that shape our daily lives and perceptions? So our lives sort of outside the moment of being engaged with a piece of art, for example, maybe. So I'm just going to throw it open. Who wants to grab a hold of that first?
Well, when I heard this question, the place that I went to with it was thinking about the place of archetypes, which we find, across different media and art forms. So I was thinking about the heroic narrative, the individual who sets out to solve a crisis, confronts and overcomes obstacles, and succeeds against great odds. And that's often joined with the quest narrative, although a quest doesn't have to be heroic. And then I'd also like to introduce the victim narrative, the story of being wronged, and having to fight back against injustice, sometimes perceived injustice, but that also seems to me an archetypal narrative. And these story containers have a lot of cultural power, and they're powerful and deeply immersive because in some ways they're easy to grasp, they're simple, they're familiar. We've been telling these kind of stories for a very long time. They're reassuring. But I think we also want to examine how they make us feel. So not just think about them as forms, but they can give form to our inchoate emotions, I think. Both that we want to feel like a hero who can overcome obstacles and feel like a victim sometimes too. And so thinking about them in all those various ways can be useful. So that's where I went with that question.
Yeah, so giving structure to our experience, but maybe also being a trap, like locking our experience into particular pathways. I don't know. Troy, what do you think?
Yeah.
Well, I think that, right now, because I will just reflect on this in terms of the Indigenous work that I've been working on. And as I found out my Métis status was confirmed in 2015. And since then, I've been trying to immerse myself and learn about the culture. And the best way that I found to do that is to collaborate constantly with members of all Indigenous nations. And so in this past year, I'm currently on a sabbatical. And one of the richest things that I'm experiencing is the tradition of storytelling and the elders like Maria Campbell, or the woman now that I'm working with, Nicole Obamsawin, who wrote the opera I just did. There is this tradition of telling stories about the history of the peoples, about how they related to each other, about how, I did a show in LA where it was a story of two brothers who fought in the same, who were separated at birth and both became sort of heroes for their nations, but ended up killing each other. And so there's all these lovely, incredible ways to connect to the history. And by doing so and learning more about these cultural experiences that I've missed out on, I feel like I'm becoming a richer person. But that's because it's building community for me. And that's what I believe theater, writing, art all does, is that the more the time that we reflect on things with each other, whether it's a villain character or sometimes we actually want to understand that person. So somebody want, sorry.
No,
Yeah.
go ahead. I was just
Yeah.
agreeing.
Yeah, I think that sometimes you want to understand that person, then really, you have to hear from someone who has that similar point of view, because you can be blocked. And if you are open and receptive to conversation, I think that you learn more.
I also I find too that there's a universality in those figures that helps us to connect and unify and find community within that storytelling paradigm. And when I go to when I teach young artists and young actors specifically, it's the idea that storytelling for me is the most powerful engine of empathy. It's the ability to see beyond ourselves and to see into the another human being. So when I'm teaching early scene work, no scene ever exists in here or in here. A scene has to exist here between the two people who are engaged and living that story moment. And for me, the more we engage with the stories of others, because story to me is a dialectic. There's a giver of the story and a receiver of that story. And the more I engage as a receiver of a story, the more I become connected to the reality of that other person and the story of that other person, and the less I'm able to other that other person. I think one of the things we're losing is that ability to connect and to drive that engine of empathy. And so it becomes easier and easier the more isolated and individual we become to other that person when we don't know their story.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about the archetypes, both in the context of teaching and needing to identify them and also really question that heroic archetype, question its concentration on the individual story. And I was thinking about, the victim narrative too, I have to say, in this political moment, and those who sort of are claiming in a political context of a victim status that might be quite problematic. I do feel quite consumed at the moment by our current moment and set of emergencies. So, yeah, and so I've really been thinking, I would just want to say, that I've been my thoughts about storytelling have been, are being shaped by this moment at which we find ourselves. And so I feel like it's important to acknowledge the archetypes and their power, but also be able to question them. But we need to recognize them first, their value and their history and tradition, and then how we might also break them open.
Are you finding it interesting? I'm finding it interesting in that when you say questioning them, I'm finding it really interesting the inability to hear what's coming at us in a truthful way, that we're losing that. I find myself often hearing a storytelling moment, seeing that story being received, and saying to myself, that is not the story you were just told. How did you manage to bend it to your own narrative and to your own reality? And it just sparked in me when you said that.
I was just saying to these guys earlier that I just went to visit my parents for the first time in like 4 months because I've been away so much, and they were watching Fox News for the entire 90 minutes that I was there, and I just held my breath the whole time trying to pray and convince them to go to another source. One other thing that I think that can help us in this moment while we're trying to sort of evaluate what is truth and what is not truth, but also how we can, as Canadians, sort of reflect on the positive ways that we have moved forward, and that things like I feel very honored that I got to direct and design this opera Nanotasis. And one of the reasons for that is this sort of telling of a story that these were three creation stories, right? There are three stories for that were accessible to all ages, and we learned a lot from each other because it was a mixture of Indigenous people and non-Indigenous settlers, but what became very most important to us were the talkbacks at the end. And at one point, and this I just want to say, this is what some of the positive stuff that we can be reflecting on. There was this was an Abenaki puppetry opera, and there was an Abenaki woman who had seen the ad in the paper, and she came with her son and came to us in tears during the talkback saying she finally felt validated because she had found an experience that did that, and that her son was singing the songs, the Abenaki songs from the opera along with us, and hearing those kinds of stories where we're actually able to share, and that was said out loud to 300 other people who are watching the talkback. These kinds of like important moments that that we can build. I think that's the way that we sort of survive this chaos right now.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, that's a really beautiful story, Troy, and it makes me think about the way that story is a form of paying attention. I mean, it's a way of making the invisible visible, or the, what's been unseen or decentered, as Dylan is talking about. But and I'm always reminded, and I say this to my students too, when I think about the word attention, how in its Latin roots is the word tendere, which means to stretch towards, to reach out towards. And so there's that possibility of reciprocity. And when I do think about storytelling work, as you've both seen, and Dylan has emphasized this too, the importance of listening. So, I mean, to tell a story is also, it needs to be heard. The story doesn't really exist unless it's heard by someone else or by many other people. And so the possibility of reciprocity that's at the heart of storytelling seems so important.
So what does that look like? I think this is a fascinating theme, right? So we started out talking about storytelling, but now we're placing at least as much emphasis, I think, on sort of story receiving, right? Being a receiver of stories. Is that something that we should be paying equal attention to? Is that something that we should be educating people about? What does that look like?
I think so. I mean, I know we may be leaping ahead, and there is a question about agency. And there's great agency in telling stories, but there is, I think we also have to think about the agency in listening, and listening is an active position. And there's an amazing group in the States called, I think it's Narrative 4, and I learned a lot from them in terms of listening practice in the classroom, and actually teaching students to listen to each other in paired work with great attentiveness. And it's really revelatory. I could say much more, but I'm, want to stop there.
We do the same thing in my practice. Often I find myself teaching and talking a lot about the power of humility, vulnerability, and accountability. Mm-hmm. So that's that idea of being able to open yourself up to receiving a story, whether I'm in a public forum listening to a storyteller or engaged in a conversation, or whether I'm actually in the work of performing, is the ability to be able to sit in a conversation, receiving information, and not having that impulse to be defensive about your positionality within that story. And to be able to honestly take in, we found this I had the pleasure of assistant directing the opera here, and we had many conversations with the non-Indigenous students about the difference between appropriation and engagement. So great fear of being accused of appropriative behavior, and not understanding the difference between engagement and appropriation.
Yeah, the elders were invited the students to come and learn dances, for instance, that were part of the opera, and the students were very resistant to that idea because they thought that was inappropriate for them. So I think that there's a whole bunch of whether you can have a faculty person and you can have a person of the nation who's like an elder tell you things are okay, but because there is other language that's been taught to them and communicated, and it's good that it's being talked about, right? And it's not necessarily informed, but it's being talked about. I think that's important.
But I wonder if we're also, if it's important for us to also teach what engagement actually means and
Yeah.
looks like
Yeah.
when it comes to cross-cultural collaborations. What does it?
So what does it look like?
That's a really hard thing, and that's what this whole year for me has been about. I've done 3 Indigenous projects. One being this one that's a mixture. That's an Abenaki storytelling. It was started and workshopped here, and then it went on to workshop in Montreal, and then presented in this big international festival. And then I also have a current project that is it's called Pure Native. It's in Rochester. It's all native, so all native playwright, director, creative team, and actors. It's the first time that this has happened in an American theater, in a main stage, what they call a main stage, which I have resistance to. But so there's that important thing of working within the nation. So I've also done a fair amount of work outside of that. For instance, I did something called the Wisdom Tree, where I commissioned 4 Indigenous artists from different nations to create stories that were told inside of an artwork. And I think that it's a really difficult thing because within the community that's Indigenous, there are formalities and expectations that are different within each nation. So I think that what I've come to understand is I'm a really good coordinator of listening to all that and finding the moments. For instance, yesterday I'm building this giant river made out of textiles for the show there, and we've commissioned 6 community members to create textiles for us, artworks. And one of them came in yesterday, and she saw it for the first time, and then she gave me a whole bunch of thoughts that at first I was like, holy crap, you're telling me it sucks. No, she didn't mean it sucks, but she was like, kind of like a lot of stuff was like, oh, we wouldn't do this in this nation. But then listening to that, because there's also 6 other people who are working with me on this thing, right? So how do I take the notes from that person, make sure that they're heard, apply it to the work? I think that there's techniques that we all have to learn. Beyond that, I think that there's also a chat we could have just about, I know we did a land acknowledgement, but within the communities, how we can be doing more active ways of doing that.
Yeah, and just to follow along what Troy is saying, thinking about your representation of the river, one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of my own fiction writing and the new novel I'm working on now, which is inspired by the life of the American environmentalist Rachel Carson, coming out of my last story collection, where I'm thinking a lot about relations between humans and the more than human living world, and how do we represent that in fiction on the page. And there's a listening, but we're listening to the living world that can't necessarily talk back, at least in our language. And so, but how do I represent that, those encounters, those experiences, that reciprocity, which I feel it's really important that we pay attention to now in an existential way, that we pay attention to the rest of the living world, that we bring the rest of the living world into our stories, even as there are, legal battles to give personhood to rivers and other living beings. And, that's a different kind of storytelling, that's involved in the legal side of things. But as a writer of fiction, it's something that preoccupies me a great deal right now.
So you have so much that's fascinating, so many directions to go from here. I'm going to pick up on what you said, Catherine, in terms of in bringing non-human elements into story. So I guess we think of story. I think of storytelling in terms of an expression of a certain kind of human experience. Do you want to suggest that it should be more diverse than that, or is it more to do with capturing our human experience of the natural world? Should the natural world be an agent in our stories? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think that the living world beyond the human should have agency in our stories, but at the same time, I never want to tell someone else how to tell a story or really tell anyone how to tell a story. I mean, I do think it's important that we consider that, but I'm not going to be programmatic ever and say this is how to do that. But I just think it's important. The question of where we place our attention is crucial with our stories, and so to pay attention to the natural world beyond the living, whether it's water or land or trees or air or birds, is crucial, I think, at this moment, even as so much of that world is being lost. We need to pay attention to it and then figure out how to bring it into our stories. And there's a myriad of ways in which that can be done, whether it's on stage, and I'm sure you have ideas, Troy.
I would say that there's something. I mean, every culture has folklore or stories that talk about the creation of the world and the nation and nature. And so I think going back and really understanding those historical kind of passed on verbiage of how things are created. Like I remember one of the things from my wisdom tree was a tale called How the Birds Got Their Song. And just the text of that being so magical about why this little bird got a certain beautiful sound and why the crow got this horrible sound, right? Like meanings for that were given to these things by a people that actually give us sort of an inspiration of like, maybe that, I don't know that the creator did that, but it's an interesting way to look at the world. And I think that if we were able to, as a nation, especially at this time, celebrate the stories of all of the people from all of our, the entire community of BIPOC, all of this that's being written in the United States. If we were able to celebrate that in a much bigger way, I think that would be our way to sort of help, again, connect the world back together, can it make Canada stronger in a way?
I do find on that note that immediately leads to the illumination of the universality of good teachings. Like the more I engage with, had the privilege and pleasure of going on the 2-row on the Grand canoe trip, which is Ellie Joseph and Jay Bailey are the founders of this program, where for 10 days, from Cambridge to the mouth of the Grand River in Fort Erie, 100 paddlers in 2 rows, one Indigenous and one ally, paddle down the Grand River, sharing the natural world, connecting with the water, camping, sharing meals, sharing story, guest speakers. It is the most profound experience I have ever been on. And the takeaway for me for that was there will always be more that connects us than drives us apart. And the power of that engagement, as you say, with the natural world was equally as vibrant and important in that experience as was the story sharing between human beings. So there, medicine walks and bird watching walks and all of this connective tissue. And I think when we engage in active storytelling and active listening, that's what comes to the forefront of these things. And one thing I did want to mention, that an interesting thing that has always stayed with me from a talk by Mary Kate Craig, who is a SOPR PhD candidate who might have already defended. But she's a settler by ancestry and an environmental researcher, and has a partnership with a group, Stephen Nitka from the Dene First Nation around Great Slave Lake. But when she was speaking about her work, she talked about being in service of the Indigenous-led project that was happening up there. And that profoundly hit me as something I got deeply connected to the idea of being in service of someone else's story, and how in cross-cultural collaboration and it's what I talked about a lot to the non-Indigenous students in the opera project, was the power of just being there, open to someone else's story when we were invited into it, and going, here is my talent, here is my experience, here is my body, what do you need of it? And not placing ourselves in the center of that experience, but joining the circle as a member of the human community and just saying, how can I be of service? And that has profoundly stayed with me throughout those experiences.
So, I mean, one thing that's very clear is that stories are very powerful, right? That stories can create identity, stories can change people's minds, question mark. I mean, so how and do you think that stories contribute to building an identity for an individual, for a community? Do you think stories play a role in shifting people's trajectories and changing their views about the environment, for example? And what kind of responsibilities do storytellers have because of the power of stories? I'm just going way off script here. There's a whole ton of stuff in there.
Yeah.
So what do you, I'd love to hear your reactions.
Oh gosh. I mean, I guess I want to think about the very different kinds of stories that there are. And so I'm going to think about three kinds that interest me. So I'm a writer of fiction. And so I'm thinking about what can fiction do in this storytelling landscape. And we often go to fiction for emotional truths. And I was re-listening to the British writer Kazuo Ishiguro, who found himself wondering during the first Trump administration, what's the point, what's the purpose of, or the place of fiction's emotional truths in an era of authoritarian belief? And when I think about what fiction can do, I think that it's emotional truth, but it also can give us imaginative experiences of complexity and doubt and questions and self-contradiction and ambiguity. Gives us a zone in which to play out, acknowledge all those those feelings, those experiences. And by complexity, I don't just mean complication, but complexity as a way of thinking about relationships and consequence, which feels to me really essential. It's an ecological way of thinking, of making relationship. And I'd set that against authoritarian stories that want to ignore deeper lines of consequence and connection and want to manipulate the world or coerce people into believing the world is a certain way that may ignore other realities. And so those are the possibilities for fiction that I see. And then I also want to think about what stories can do in a climate context, and as Troy and Dill have been saying, the incredible place for collaboration within stories and thinking about how stories can tell stories of collaboration and how difficult that can be when we're used to heroic narratives, but how essential it is to figure out how to tell these stories that are polyphonic and bring in all these voices. And it feels to me that's really essential work, as it's always been, but never more essential than now. And so anyway, I'll stop there with those two places that I see, different kinds of storytelling work, and leave it to you guys to follow up on more.
You're first.
Okay. I love this idea of this moving past those simple narratives into, I think of it as, when did we become afraid of making a mess a bit, of coming in and discovering those new ways of telling stories, to discover the way, because the way out of what we're in now is going to require a new way of thinking about narrative and the way we interact together, and the way we interact with our past and our future, and the ability to, I get stuck all the time not fearing stepping forward for fear of offense or fear of tripping over good intention. But this is going to take us making a mess of things.
And the energy of curiosity, I think, is so important. Wonder and curiosity in storytelling seems to me really essential.
So that leads me to just the project that I do in a lot of my classes, or in one particular here, where I'm obsessed with fairy tales, always have been all of my life. And so in that class, what I have the students do is read fairy tales that they know. I make them read it in one language, translated from one culture, another, there might be an Indian version of one, there might be an indigenous version of it. And then I have them take that, everyone has this, Cinderella, for instance, right? Everyone has this sort of image in their own head. And when we reflect back on things that we have affection for from childhood, there's wonder. I think that's a key part of this. And so one of the tasks that I do within this is that I have them completely deconstruct the fairy tales. There's this thing called, I think it's called props recipes for building for building fairy tales, and in it lists like A through JJJK or something, and there's a whole bunch of things like now the giant stomps his foot on the apple, and so what I have them do is I make them I make them break it down to like 5 moments, and then I say, now let's write that, but let's put the final moment as first and the third, and switch all the order up. What happens to that? But then what happens when you add an entirely another element? So let's say that we've also been working on I'm forgetting the other one that we use, but another from maybe some other fairy tale. What if there's a character that comes in from that? And so looking at these worlds of fairy tale that we all have images of, I think is one of the ways that make it messy, make it like be that. And what I also teach in my classes is nothing is ever done. So I work in iterations, and if a student only hands in one project that has never changed over the semester, they don't do well, right? That's absolutely and that's what they all want to do right now, right? So that's the hard thing. But I think that we have to get messy. We have to allow ourselves to make the mistakes, and to learn from them, and just be really bold about it right now, I think.
I've been TAing the first year performance class here, and everybody's looking for the right answer all the time. And I keep saying there's no right answer. There's just your answer right now in this moment.
I always say
So what is that?
in a design class, I'll say, you can put Romeo and Juliet on the moon. I don't believe that really works, but if you do it well, you'll still get the A. I don't really care. Like it's up to you. So I think that taking chancing and making people think creatively and out of the box that's one of the things that I innately put into all of my coursework.
Well, it's interesting, when you were just talking about how the birds got their song in terms of taking it back to those stories. I was comparing that, if we're just talking about what we do in class, one of the things I do in this undergraduate course that I teach called Writing Nature, which is a creative nonfiction course, but nevertheless, we're telling a story, is we have the Wild Ontario folk from, the Department of Integrative Biology bring some of their actual birds into their classroom. So we have a broad-winged hawk, and a great horned owl, and a saw-whet owl. And the students have a real chance to have a encounter, to meet these birds in some fashion. And then they need to write about that experience. And it's a true story. It's not fiction, but it comes out of that experience of being open and seeing what you might discover and how you might connect and build a relationship. Allows you to see the world somehow newly. And that's what I keep trying to encourage them to do. Not think of a story that's going to close something off, but how can we open ourselves newly to the world? How can we use the stories that we're telling, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, to open us to be changed and see something in a way that we hadn't seen it before?
Can I ask you? I'm really interested in. I know you obviously have a publisher and an editor who are solely focused on product, but I'm interested in hearing you talk there. What's your relationship between process and product, and that balance between the two, or do you lean one way or the other?
I mean, it takes me several years to write a book, and it's a journey of discovery. I mean, you don't want to start a story, a novel, knowing in advance what you want to put on the page. You want to discover through the course of writing and be changed and somehow initiate change in your readers or listeners. So I do always think of it as a reciprocal act. And a story is a gift, ultimately, a gift to somebody else. And I do think it's really important to think about stories in the context of this reciprocal exchange. And so you talk about product, but if I'm thinking about a book, even in a classroom situation, I'm always trying to point out a book needs readers. And we need to think of ourselves not just as writers, but as readers, and bring that energy of reading and listening to our culture, our writing culture, our publishing culture. We need to be both.
This goes back to the idea of immersion, right? And so there is this. I remember in my second master's there being this. I don't remember the theorist's name who talked about there being six types of participation in spectatorship and viewership, and what the two far ends being the active participator who actually knows your body of work, and they can go in and they're educated about it and they get immersed in it because they have all this understanding. And then it goes all the way down to like the husband that goes with the wife to go and see, a Monet thing, but has no interest in it. And but as artists, what I take value in that is how do we make that person be interested? That's about curiosity, I think. It's about creating something that's different, that isn't status quo. And so pushing boundaries to me is key to storytelling and to actively have viewership that is participating in and learning or exploring their own being by hearing the story.
Yeah, this is so. Unfortunately, we're getting a bit short on time now. We're running towards the end of the time. But this theme of the complexity of participating in the giving and receiving of stories, I think, has been really, really interesting. I'm going to throw you one last sort of curveball question, just to sort of maybe shoot us off in a slightly different direction, or maybe revisit some of what we talked about. What's the relationship between storytelling and truth? Is there some sort of obligation for storytellers to be truthful in some deep sense, or not?
I'm going to be tricky here and reframe the question because I've already talked about truth a little bit in terms of emotional truths that fiction can open us to. But when we're talking about stories, I think it's really important to talk about belief, and that belief isn't just one thing, and that there are different ways of believing in stories. And there's stories that we enter. I mean, they're fabulous, fantastic. They're completely untrue, but there's just great enjoyment in following the voice of a miraculous storyteller. And then there are other stories that we may know are untrue, but we want to believe them. And we see this in political context because they make us feel what we want to feel, or they confirm something that we want to feel. And that can slide into dangerous forms of belief. And so it's really important, I think, to differentiate and also acknowledge the place of desire in belief, and that being part of our approach to stories, and that will nuance what the truths might be. But we do have to consider what truth is. But truth and belief, thinking about those two things, I think goes hand in hand.
It's easy for us to also overlook the incredible destructive power of story as well when it is wielded in that fashion. I think back to the narratives that I grew up with and were taught in school of the history of this country, of colonial exceptionalism and entitlement, And there is a reason, I believe, that truth comes before reconciliation in that context. That unwinding those narratives is an important step for me personally in the work I'm doing. And you can hear more about it at my dissertation defense at some point. So the idea of truth in this moment in time is becoming very cloudy for me, and there's a lot to work out, and I'm not sure where it's living in me right now.
The only thing I would want to, I'll just share one thing that happened to me yesterday that I noticed. I was driving back from Rochester, and I don't know if you know that region, but it goes from being very sort of, liberal in Rochester to super almost Alabama in that part. And I noticed that I was driving through the Tuscarora Reserve, that the three schools there were called Colonial Elementary, Colonial Junior High, and Colonial High School. And so when we enter into environments where we're already, there's that I just think there's a big statement that's said with that in terms of what we're dealing with at this time. But yeah, anyhow, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. I've really, really enjoyed the conversation, appreciated your insights. Thank you so much for taking part in this. And I'm excited to continue this series of Why Arts Matter conversations so that we can have more conversations of this sort. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.